Good evening, everyone. I'm Nancy Netzer, inaugural Robert L. and Judith T. Winston Director of the McMullen Museum and Professor of Art History at Boston College. I want to welcome you, patrons and members of the McMullen Museum, to the members' virtual lectures by the curators of our two fall exhibitions. In the Monin Gallery, Arnie Jarmack photographing Chelsea in transition, 1977 to 1989, and in the Daily Family Gallery, American Alternative Comics, 1980 to 2000, Raw, Weirdo, and Beyond. Each lecture will run approximately 30 minutes, followed by 10 minutes for questions. And since this is a meeting, I'd ask you all to please mute yourselves. Our first speaker this evening will be the co-curator of Alternative Comics, John McCoy, Assistant Director for Multimedia and Design Services at the McMullen Museum. As a graduate student in the 1990s, McCoy began investigating how teaching comics had recently become fashionable in universities and how individual works of comics began to appear in literary publications like the New York Review of Books. McCoy has been a web designer for public radio, as well as an illustrator for periodicals and children's books. And for the past 2 decades, he has designed all of the McMullen's catalogs and didactics. In 1992, his Crushed Flowers was awarded Best Comic in the Strips category for Boston Comic News. Unfortunately, the other co-curator of Alternative Comics, Andre Molitou, senior lecturer in art history at the University of Indiana, Bloomington, is unable to join us this evening because he is teaching. John McCoy will introduce us to the exhibition. Please put any questions for him in the chat, and he will try to get to as many of them as he can in the allotted time. And now, please join me in welcoming John McCoy as he shares his screen.
Thank you. Thanks, Nancy. Yes, I will share the screen. Everybody see that? Okay. So, American Alternative Comics, 1980 to 2000, Raw, Weirdo, and Beyond. This exhibition explores alternative comics, that is, comics over which the artist has full authorship and ownership, published by small presses or in other non-traditional venues. It focuses upon a specific time of change when cartoonists were experimenting with new styles, forms, themes, and modes. This was the era that gave birth to what is now known as the graphic novel, a long-form narrative in comics that is published as a standalone book. It's a useful term, but it's also a way to avoid using the word comics. In other words, a way to legitimize the form. The question of legitimacy, are comics a unique art form? Should people take comics seriously? Is one with which the artists in this exhibition grappled. In this presentation, I will introduce 2 comics anthologies, Raw and Weirdo, and a few representative works from the exhibition by artists associated with each. The exhibition also has a 3rd section, the And Beyond section, which deals with other artists who published in the alternative press. A word to people watching at home. These examples have a lot of detail, and I apologize if they're hard to make out on your screen. I suggest making your zoom as big as you can, and for some of these works, I will provide some close-up details. But that's just a good excuse for you to come to the museum and see these works in person. First of all, a little bit of history. By the late 1970s, comics were at something of a low point creatively and in their public perception. During the anti-communist era of the 1940s and 50s, comic books were seen as a corrupting force for American youth. In 1945, the Senate Judiciary Committee's subcommittee to investigate juvenile delinquency, which is the picture here, held hearings on comics, focusing on the most lurid examples available. In the wake of this bad publicity, several comics publishers established the Comics Code Authority, a self-censoring board, which imposed strict limitations on comic book content. The only mainstream comics that survived were those seen as appropriate to children. Newspaper comics of the same time fared little better. While in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, comics had held a central place in American pop culture, by the 1970s, newspaper strips have become smaller, simpler, and focused more and more upon gag strips. Following the success of Charles Schulz's Peanuts, many syndicates preferred comics with the potential of licensable characters. In the 1960s, a new form became popular, the underground comic book. Sold in head shops, these were associated with the counterculture and featured broad satire and adult content. Here we see Zap, created by Robert Crumb in 1968, the most famous title of underground comics. By the late 70s, underground comics too were failing as the counterculture itself waned. In 1975, Art Spiegelman and Bill Griffith published Arcade, an attempt to make a more professional version of the underground comic that might feature a greater variety of styles and subjects. Unfortunately, Arcade was unable to find a working distribution model, and it folded in 1977. However, in its style, format, and the artists it published, Arcade was a precursor to both Raw and Weirdo. Now let's look at the anthology Raw and at some works by its contributors in this exhibition. The anthology Raw, the first issue of which is shown here, ran from 1980 to 1999, and it was an attempt at legitimizing the comics form by presenting comics as an art object. The oversized magazine was sold in independent bookstores as well as comic shops. Raw's editors, Art Spiegelman and Françoise Mouly, brought a new professionalism to the design and organization of the comics anthology. They featured artists' names prominently and ran work by both European and American cartoonists, as well as featuring classic works from the early days of comics history. While Spiegelman and Mouly were passionate about comics' potential, they also approached the issue of the form's bad reputation with humor and with irony. In the exhibition, Art Spiegelman, Comics as a Medium for Self-Expression. This is a good example of a work that deconstructs comics standing vis-a-vis the categories of highbrow and lowbrow art. Its central panel depicts a cleanly rendered image of a woman scolding a man. Comics as a medium for self-expression? Oh, John, you're such a fool. This panel, in its simplified flat figures and overwrought dialogue, resembles a painting by the pop artist Roy Lichtenstein. Lichtenstein was known for copying, without permission or attribution, excerpts from comic books in his paintings, supposedly elevating these images to the level of fine art in the process. Spiegelman subverts this by using comics to make more comics. This image also parodies the pretensions of fine art, with the male character depicted wearing a beret and standing in an artist's loft. One note, if you do come see this in the exhibition, that central image does not have the color bin day dots in it. It was done in black and white, and the color was added later when this was printed. Françoise Mouly, Industry News and Review, number 6. Françoise Mouly also uses ironic appropriation in her Industry News and Review, number 6, which copies its panels from a printing industry trade magazine, altering the figure right here to resemble Muley herself. Muley had trained as an architect, and aside from her editorial duties, she was the graphic designer for Raw. In this comic, she muses on whether the process of printing and designing can also be considered art making. The comic's dialogue can be read as an imagined conversation with Spiegelman and as an examination on how some work is valued and other work is devalued. Gary Panter from Jimbo is Stepping Off the Edge of a Cliff. Whoops. Panter trained as a painter, and his career has been divided between his work for galleries and his work for publication. In both forms, Panter mixes a painterly style that recalls the then current neo-expressionist movement with images drawn from newspaper comics, hot red cartoons, and other vernacular forms. In a cycle of loosely related Jimbo stories, he tells the story of a naive young punk living in a dystopian future, a city that is half Dallas and half Tokyo. These stories run the gamut between light humor and extreme pathos, as in this picture of a flayed horse running through the city after a nuclear holocaust. R. Sikoryak's good old Gregor Brown. R. Sikoryak's work relies heavily upon the traditional distinctions of high and low art. He most often retells a classic work of literature through the form of a well-known comic strip. Here, he retells Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, using Charles Schulz's Peanuts characters. The humor very much relies upon the viewer's familiarity with both works and how their juxtaposition feels incongruous. The comic plays with the concepts of highbrow and lowbrow, but ultimately must maintain this division for its effect. Mark Newgarden, Love's Savage Fury. A more complicated and confusing repurposing of iconic comic characters. This comic imagines a chance encounter between Bubblegum's Bazooka Joe and Ernie Bushmiller's Nancy. Bazooka Joe is smitten with Nancy, but can only express his love using a comic strip gag. I want to see you again, in case I forget what you look like. For the next 2 pages, 3 years pass, and Nancy's already iconic geometric features deconstruct into a swirling mass of floating forms. When the 2 characters are reunited on the final page, Joe takes a photograph of Nancy, but the moment for connection is past. Chris Ware, Untitled Quimby Mouse comic. Chris Ware has written that reading Raw enlarged his conception of what comics could be. In his own comics, like this untitled piece that ran in the student newspaper, The Daily Texan, we can see the appropriation of earlier comics imagery, such as the mouse drawn in the style of Max Fleischer, with a radically new way of arranging comics formally. Traditionally, comic panels are read like words, left to right and top to bottom, with the sequence showing the temporal order of events. In this comic, the action, such as it is, all takes place in this lower strip, which shows the 2-headed mouse Quimby in bed. One head is aging prematurely and the other head is understandably worried. The majority of the comic takes place in the head's thought balloon. Here, the panels are arranged as an interconnecting grid showing relationship between memories, objects, and places. The panels are not organized in time, but in space. This comic and others by Ware brought him to the attention of Woolley and Spiegelman, and he eventually published in the last 2 issues of Raw. Next, let's turn to the other anthology, Weirdo. Here's the first issue of Weirdo from 1981. Weirdo ran from 1981 until 1993, and in some ways, it was a reaction to Raw's attempts to rehabilitate the image of comics. Initially created and edited by Robert Crumb, Weirdo featured works that were obscure and grungy. Crumb thought of comics as an art form by and for outsiders. The second editor, Peter Bagg, had been strongly influenced by the New York punk scene, and he brought an adversarial and satirical edge to the comic. The third editor, Eileen Kaminsky-Crumb, emphasized the confessional, personal storytelling of the memoir form. She published a good number of women cartoonists, some for the first time. In the exhibition, we have the first 2 pages of Robert Crumb and Eileen Kaminsky-Crumb's Our Lovely Home. Robert Crumb and Eileen Kaminsky-Crumb have both published in underground comics since in the 1960s and 70s, before their eventual meeting and marriage. They were known for drawing stories about themselves, often in unflattering ways for humorous effect. While their early work was associated with the baby boom counterculture, in this comic, the couple depicts themselves as middle-aged homeowners in the midst of a major house remodel. You can see his neighbor saying, "Boy, it's starting to look like Disneyland around here." Crumb and Kaminsky-Crumb each draw and write the dialogue for their respective characters depicted on the page. Much of the humor comes in the form of self-critically examining how this previously bohemian couple has suddenly become bourgeois. Peter Bagg, A Warning. Peter Bagg edited 8 issues of Weirdo before he left to devote himself to his solo work. This comic, A Warning, was drawn for the first issue of Kaminsky-Crumb's editorship and is an ironic repudiation of the anthology he was leaving. Here, Bagg depicts himself expressing remorse for Weirdo's nihilism and opposition to mainstream taste, going so far as to warn the viewer that reading the comic would contribute to the downfall of society. Bagg's over-the-top histrionics are a parody of various complaints which have been historically aimed at comic books. Christine Critter's Bimbos from Hell. I saw Christine in the here, and I say hi. She's on our meeting here. Weirdo's artists would often make comics out of unpleasant or even traumatic memories. This is the final page of Bimbos from Hell, in which one contributor to Weirdo, Christine Critter, eulogizes another, Dory Sita. Critter, who worked in the labor-intensive medium of scratchboard, was close friends with Sita, with whom she shared a similar lifestyle and sense of humor. Critter's work is often creepy and cute at the same time. Here she imagines a conversation with Sita's ghost. Critter makes sense of her friend's death by using the art form they shared in life. Julie Doucet's I Am Julie Doucet. In this one-page comic, the Weirdo contributor Julie Doucet shows another example of humorous self-depiction. Doucet often draws herself as an impulsive and erratic force of nature driven by whim or desire, while in real life she is quiet and shy. In this page, the fictional Julie bursts confidently into a comic shop demanding to use the bathroom. The shop's employees don't know who she is, but assume she must be important. At the bottom of the comic, Doucet writes, "Note, this is fiction, okay?" Doucet makes fun of both her own self-image and the way alternative comics share commercial space with mainstream superhero fare. Carol Tyler from Soldier's Heart. Carol Tyler is a Weirdo contributor whose work is delicately drawn and whose subjects are intensely personal. She writes mostly about her own life and the difficulties of making a living as an artist. Her longest work, which this is a page from, is Soldier's Heart, which she produced in 3 volumes over many years. It tells the story of her father's military experiences during World War II and of the intergenerational trauma which followed. Part of the comic is about Tyler's attempts to get her father to talk about his story and his reticence to admit that the war left any marks. In this image, we see him driving through a winding route from the lumberyard to his home. Tyler forgoes traditional panel division and lets the viewer's eyes direct the movement in time through the page's singular image. Hidden in the landscape are the words, "Not all scars are visible." And beyond. This era saw a growth in a variety of other alternative comics venues, such as small presses and independent newspapers. The final section of the exhibition features a variety of artists who published in the 1980s and 1990s. Here are a few examples. Keith Knight, The K Chronicles, Caldwell. Knight's comics often use silly, broad humor to explore difficult issues of race. Here, mime Milton Caldwell finds himself caught between racial tensions and expectations. Many of Knight's strips are reflections on how individuals are pressured to conform, both by their own social groups and by others. Knight draws his comics using markers, which are a fit for his loose, rubbery approach to figures. The artist credits the animator Chuck Jones as an influence. Other of his childhood favorites include the newspaper strip cartoonists Charles Schulz and Gary Trudeau. Allison Bechtel, A Page from Fun Home. Bechtel worked on Fun Home, her most famous work, for 7 years. The book explores her complicated relationship with her father, her childhood in the family funeral home, and her search for identity. Bechtel literally embodied her character's experiences. For almost every panel, she shot her own photo references, using herself as a model, whether depicting her father, her mother, or herself. Bechtel also includes throughout the book depictions of archival photos, maps, infographics, and illustrations, such as here, where we see this chart of the human circulatory system on the wall. Gilbert Hernandez, Tonnets is a print by Gilbert Hernandez. Gilbert Hernandez's intricate and lengthy stories are set in the fictional Central American town of Palomar. Palomar is a humble village, a magical place where supernatural events happen with regularity. It is similar to settings of works in magical realism by such authors as Lorca or Garcia Marquez. In this print, we see one of Palomar's inhabitants, the street merchant Tonnets, leaning against a weathered wall. By the time that Beto produced this print, the character of Tonnets had actually died in the story of the comic book. So as viewers, we don't know whether this is actually her alive or a ghost. So I hope that this small selection of works has introduced you to some of the exhibition's themes and given you a taste of some of the pieces you'll see when you come. There are 120 works in the exhibition, and I can't possibly begin to cover all of them. So please come see them in person. Thank you.
John, thank you so much for this wonderful introduction to quite a brilliant, groundbreaking exhibition. And I'm wondering if you see any questions in the chat. And if there...
Not yet, no, but
if not, perhaps we can have people, if there's anyone who would like to ask a question, that person could unmute him or herself.
I just had a question. Do you differentiate, and I'm sorry, and this is about 5 minutes of the presentation, but do you differentiate between comics and graphic novels in just the exhibition or some of them?
I'm having a hard time hearing you, but what I heard was to talk about the difference between comics and graphic novels.
Yes, quite right.
Right. Comics as a term refers to this form of using images sequentially, often with words, and the definition of what comics are is very, very complicated, and people argue about it a lot. The term graphic novel had actually been used for a while in the 1970s before Mouse got published for the first time in 1986. And at that point, the publisher Pantheon decided to market it as a graphic novel, partly because there just wasn't any place to put the book Mouse in a bookstore. At that time, I remember seeing it in bookstores in the humor section alongside, Peanuts anthologies and things like that, because they didn't know what it was. And so the title of graphic novel is a way of providing a sense of legitimacy, but it does have use because it does refer to a specific kind of comic, a long narrative in book form. But one of the reasons why I make this distinction is that's not the only way the comics can be done, nor is it necessarily, the appropriate way for each cartoonist. And in this exhibition, we see a lot of examples of people working in different forms, some of them narrative, some of them like comics journalism, comics essays, humor comics, comics that have no narrative at all and are completely abstract. And so I think it's an important distinction to make. I know that Spiegelman actually resisted the term graphic novel at first because he thought it was kind of highfalutin, but he eventually came around.
And I think we've got a few questions here in the chat, John. One is, what continuities, this is from Andrew Cohn, what continuities and discontinuities do you see between and among the comic artists? Were they taking inspiration as artists, one from another? Or was each artist just following his or her own individual idiosyncratic preference?
The cartoonists in this exhibition were very influenced by each other. Since the days of the underground cartooning, cartoonists worked within communities of cartoonists who often were proximate to each other. Raw was largely made up of people working in New York, students at the School for Visual Arts. Weirdo was largely centered around San Francisco, and there was a lot of crossover. Both Spiegelman and Crumb acknowledge each other as important influences, and both of them point to other people as influences. Both Spiegelman and Crumb, for example, were enormously influenced by Harvey Kurtzman, who was the original writer and editor for Mad Magazine. As I point out in the piece by Christine Critter, most of these people knew each other, or at least knew some of the other people, and there was a lot of influence going on. This exhibition goes from 1980 to 2000, so by the time we get to the end, people like Chris Ware had already been reading Raw as a student, or people like Jim Woodring had already been reading Weirdo in the last decade, and they took that forward into the next decade.
And we have another question here from Tom Miles. Having recently seen the movie Elvis, I'm struck by how both comics and rock and roll were considered as corrupting and degenerate in the 40s and early 50s, to their parallel progress to respectability and ultimately an art form. can you expound on the historical relationship between comics and rock and roll?
It's an interesting question. In some ways, they were both victims of the baby boom's post-war anti-communist hysteria. There was a sense that there were these forms out there that were going to corrupt people. Comic books had actually become very popular during World War II amongst the GIs, because comic books were distributed to the GIs on the front. But when they came back, a lot of the comic books aimed at older readers were exactly the comics that got targeted by the Senate committee for being too violent, being subversive. I mean, the connection between comics and rock and roll. There was that famous album cover that Robert Crumb did for Janis Joplin. There's a very famous, iconic cover he did. And what's kind of ironic about that is Crumb himself is not a fan of rock and roll music. Crumb likes folk and roots and blues and that sort of thing. There definitely was a strong crossover between punk and comics. Peter Bagg was one artist. Other artists like John Holmstrom all came out of that 1970s punk scene. It's a little bit beyond my ability to talk about it, I guess.
We have another question in here from Marianne Jafuni, and that is, what, if any, influence did Mad Magazine have on these cartoonists?
A huge influence. As I mentioned before, both Crumb and Spiegelman point to Mad Magazine as being enormously influential to them as children. Spiegelman focused upon Kurtzman's skills as a cartoonist. He said he thought of Kurtzman as just an excellent cartoonist who perfected the form of comics. Crumb tended to see Mad as a reflection of real life. That and it's interesting that both took sort of different things away from them. Also, you probably know Harvey Kurtzman was responsible for Wacky Packages and for Garbage Pail Kids at Topps Gum. And when he was questioned about Garbage Pail Kids, which was also seen as a corrupting influence on youth, he was very proud. He said, "This is like Mad Magazine for the next generation."
And we have another question from a former colleague of ours in the French department, Mathilde Bruckner. Any influence from the bande dessinée, which has a certain cachet in French culture?
Definitely. Françoise Mouly is from Paris, and the comics she read were all from the Francophone world. There was a strong tradition in France and in Belgium of these longer comics published in folio form. And we all know Asterix, we all know Tintin or something like that. And those were, there was a history there. The term bande dessinée is just the French word for comics, and it just means designed bands of pictures. It's in some ways it's funny because it's one of the most descriptive terms for comics there is. Every culture has their own term. In Italy, comics are called fumetti, which means little puffs of smoke. and refers to the word balloons coming out of people's mouths. And from my perspective, they're just different translations of the same thing.
If there aren't any more questions now, I have one that I would like to pose to you, John, and that is, I know when you started working on this exhibition and on your research, you felt that you wanted to examine more closely these comics as works of fine art. And I'm wondering if you can expound a bit on how successful you think this show has been in shifting the emphasis from the role of the literary work to a work of fine art.
Thank you, Nancy. That's certainly one of the things that is interesting about comics, is to the extent that they today do have a certain academic cachet, it's as an alternative form of literature. They tend to be taught in English classes alongside other novels. And that's another, I think, result of the term graphic novel. It emphasizes that these are narrative stories. In the very earliest days of attempts to get comics into the culture at large, there were attempts to put comics up on walls, and whenever you present comics on walls, that does tend to emphasize them more as physical works of art that are experienced the way you would experience a painting or a photograph. I think the experience of seeing these things in person is quite startling, because you can see a lot of the artist's hand in what's on the wall. They retain the sketches in many cases, the pencil sketches. They retain any corrections or paste overs. They're a record of the process, and all those things make tangible a work that was designed to be reproduced. However, that said, I also know that many cartoonists resist the idea of the comics as an art form, like an art object. They are committed to the idea that the printed work is the final work, and that is the work of art, is the comic book. That varies from cartoonist to cartoonist. I think that it's wonderful to have the chance to now at Boston College, in the same campus, you can go and see the physical works, and then you can have a class in which you can read Mouse or Fun Home or Persepolis or whatever graphic novels are being taught. And I think that one informs the other, and that's part of the richness of the comics.
Thank you for that really good explanation. Nina Schneider has a question in the chat, and she's asking, why is the term comics, C-O-M-M-I-X, used?
Yeah, that was a term that was coined by Art Spiegelman, and in some ways it was about the whole issue that we talked about earlier of legitimacy. The term comics with an S implies a lot of things about the art form. It implies that it should be funny. It implies that it's disposable. It associates it with newsprint and newspapers. Spiegelman proposed this as a way of differentiating the form and removing the form from its supposed associations. I know that Hilary Shute, in her books, when she writes comics, she refers to the term comics as a singular. Comics is a medium, and that's another way that people try to make this distinction of the sad fact is that in English, we don't have a term that is not value laden or that doesn't come with its own history and expectations. In some ways, that's also the strength of English, is that it comes with all this history, and built into the word itself is this historic connection to its origins in newspaper and newsprint. If anyone wants to come up with a better term that sticks, please do.
And we have one more question in the chat. It's from Rachel Chamberlain, and she's curious about comics after 2000 and how you would view their development in the 21st century.
Well, the biggest change, of course, has been that both in their creation and in their distribution, comics have moved to digital media. This show, in some ways, is about the last gasp of analog production of comics. This means that artists can produce works without having to concern themselves primarily with how the work will be printed. You know, the works we see in this shows, the artist had to design for black and white publication. Now we can publish in color just as cheaply as we can publish in black and white. Or if you publish online or digitally, there is no printing cost. There is no distribution cost beyond the cost of the servers hosting those comics. There's been a big change. I think that because of the legitimacy that came out of this era, and because of some very critical works, and those works would be works like Mouse and Fun Home and Persepolis and maybe Jimmy Corrigan and Black Hole, and there's been more recent work that I'm blanking on the name right now, so I won't even try. But what has happened is, I think this whole issue of high and low art is less of an issue for people reading comics today. I think that people don't concern themselves with that. I also think that outlets like Raw and Weirdo are largely gone. People do not publish in anthologies anymore. What tends to happen is people will publish their initial comics online on websites. A lot of the best young cartoonists of this generation are coming out of art schools and particularly out of animation and illustration programs. And they have been affected in the meantime by things like manga, which became really big in this country in the 1990s. And that style has been incorporated into, I think, the current style of comics. So a lot of things have changed. If I were to do a show on comics from the 2000s, it would look very, very different.
And we have one more question in the chat here from Hillary Chute. And she says, it's just a comment. Thanks for mentioning this, John. I've had to fight with many editors over, quote, comics is an art form, etc. It's getting easier. Scott McCloud writes about this helpfully in his book, Understanding Comics.
Right. And that's another thing that's changed in the meantime. The book, Understanding Comics, was another watershed moment in people looking at comics critically. And I think everything published since then, whether it's an agreement to or a reaction against McCloud, we're having this discussion about the grammar of comics and how they work, and that's wonderful. There's now an academic field of comic scholarship that did not exist when I was a grad school student back in the 90s.
Well, John, I think that we have run out of time. And it remains for me to thank you for a wonderful introduction to the exhibition